Hello, I'm Colin Gallagher, CEO at Onward and Upward, and you're listening to the Association 100 podcast, where each week we interview association leaders from across the country to hear how they're trying new things, taking big risks, and delivering value for their members. We'll explore the realities of what it means to work in and with associations and bring you the insights and inspiration you need to advance your career and make big changes at your association. Let's get started. Welcome back to the A100 podcast. I'm your host, Colin Gallagher, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. We're bringing back two guests from the National Wooden Pallet and Container Association, who we spoke with earlier this year for an article that most of our listeners probably saw coming out of ASAE's annual conference. And today we get to dive even deeper into the fascinating world of wooden pallets. Yep, you heard me right, wooden pallets and how they truly move the world, which was something I was just so fascinated to begin to learn about this August during that first conversation. Joining us today are Brent McClendon, President and CEO of NWPCA, and Jason Ortega, VP of Public Affairs. Brent has been the President and CEO since February of 2013, and he's spent the last 30 years in the forest products industry, serving as a forester, sales manager, lobbyist, and CEO in various private, public, and nonprofit organizations. Jason joined NWPCA in 2021, and since then has developed and expanded the association's government affairs strategy from its focus in Washington, D.C. to the international stage. He was also just recently named the 2025 Leading Trade Association Lobbyist by Association Trends. Today, we'll be talking with Brent and Jason about their really impressive journey of growth, the factors behind their remarkable revenue expansion, and the strategies that worked and some that didn't along the way to get there. Plus, we'll explore why their success holds really valuable lessons for anyone leading an association today, from business growth to global impact and the vision that's driving NWPCA forward. So let's dive in. Running an association, it's a lot like running a business. You're constantly seeking opportunities for growth, not only for your members, but for the organization itself. Your association, your charitable foundation, they've both been really fortunate to just see this remarkable growth in both impact and membership over the last decade. Can you share with us that background and what really drove that growth? And I guess also talk about how Advocacy, your pallet design system software program, and the Pallet Foundation played a role in all of that.
You look at growing an organization, you don't just get there, though, by wishing you get there, right? You don't win a Super Bowl by just wishing you get there. You've got to have outstanding athletes. In our case, we needed to build an incredibly strong team. That alone doesn't get you there, right? You've got to have a very clear strategy when it comes to what that development process looks like. And in our case, we worked on a strategic plan. We built on the staff that really all came together and ultimately created this shared vision and mission. And then you got to go resource it, right? That alone doesn't do it. You got to go build that resource base. And in our case, all that came together through many of the elements we'll dive into today.
I love that you talk about being able to resource it too, because I do think associations often have these big goals and then small teams, and small teams can do a lot if they're equipped to handle it. But if not, you're just setting up for failure. So I think you guys really approached it in a strategic way to make that happen and to drive that growth.
Tools. So we have the pallet design system that you referenced. It's a software program that allows you to customize pallets to meet whatever needs. And 90% of everything in the United States and world move on pallets. And so from our standpoint, that gave us this great insight, not only into the business, but also some of the pressing needs of our industry.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that 90% stat, because you all said that to us when we met at ASAE conference this summer. And I remember looking at my teammate, Megan, and we both just, our jaws dropped. And when you think about it, because it's not something that comes to mind right away, but it also reflects back to the true power of trade associations and why they're so important. And while we may joke that there's a trade association for everything, it's because there's a need, and what an incredible need and huge opportunity for you all.
And what happens when you're that connected to the industry, and I'll tee up Jason here in just a minute, when you're that connected to the industry, they're talking to you about issues that matter for their business. And when they start talking about issues that matter for their business, it doesn't take you long to recognize that government matters for your business, whether it's regulatory or it's legislative or it's US or it's international. And we realized we really needed to up our game when it came to policy. Pallets move the world, then you need to have a world voice. How do you build a world voice? Here again, you need to have a strategic approach, but you've got to have competency and capacity on your team to deliver that growth.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to dive into some specific advocacy stuff throughout this conversation. But Jason, I'm interested in just overall how you feel advocacy has really helped fuel this massive membership growth that the association has seen.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Brent was talking about and the fact that we are unable to be effective at advocacy if our members are not just resourcing that effort, but taking the time to actually talk to us about what are their challenges, what is it that they're hearing from their customers, because so much of what we do on an advocacy is driven not just by what is necessary for the industry, but as we'll talk about here shortly, is also what is needed by our members' customers as well. The role that we play as a trade association, it's not just to find issues to advocate on behalf just so that I can stay busy, but it's to be able to deliver value to our members and to really lead the charge, particularly for a sector like ours, to be able to lead on an issue that no one else is really going to be able to speak about with the global perspective, with the subject matter expertise that we're able to do. Not because I'm necessarily a pallet expert, but going back to that team perspective, right? The team that we have here has folks who are much smarter than I am, been doing this work for a long time and are able to really dig in on the specifics of the industry, the specifics of kind of what goes into making a pallet that securely transports packaging, securely transports products around the world. And with all of that data, we're able to go into policymakers' offices and really make a difference and really punch above our weight for our industry size. We're really proud of everything we've been able to accomplish, but we also recognize that it is a bit of a success story because of the fact that we have that data and that backing that enables us to go in and not just trust us, this is what we need, or this is what the sector needs, but it's also, we're able to point to data that's oftentimes third-party verified and not just a feel-good story, but actually hard data that enables us to be effective.
Yeah, you said so many good things there, but one thing I want to call out for our listeners and bring attention back to was when you talked about, listening to other people and gathering information from all sorts of places. I am a big believer that the smartest people are the ones that believe they're not the smartest people in the room because they're willing to learn and they're always getting new things. And in essence, they become the smartest people and they are able to do the best things because it's this huge team effort and you're bringing together so many great minds. And I think that's something all associations can take to heart when they're thinking about their advocacy efforts, their membership efforts, you name it, is that it can't be one person's sole vision. It has to be a gathering of ideas and what's best for the industry and research and pulling it all together. And so I love that you said that. But like I said, I do really think anyone who's willing to say that actually is one of the smartest people. And I'll stand by that. One thing I want to get into before we dive into too much specifics is your growth has just blown me away. The global footprint you have now has expanded quickly from primarily this US-based member organization to a presence in 40 countries. That blew my mind. You've just recently launched a chapter in Mexico as well. How are you fueling this international expansion?
I appreciate that, and we're very proud of it as well. And I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier, right? You've got to have an incredibly strong team. You've got to have volunteers that are absolutely all in, and you've got to have this shared vision, unity of purpose and mission. In our case, all of that came together very well when we sat down and very intentionally built a strategic plan about 10 years ago. We had focus groups, town hall meetings, all of the typical process that us associations work through when we look to build that strategic plan. And it became very clear that for a couple of reasons, our global thought leadership role was really needed, whether it was on the policy side, but also on the tools and technology side. I mentioned pallet design system earlier. That's the global standard in international language of pallet design, right? All pallet producers anywhere can use that. And associations are always looking for non-dues revenue. We're not looking to just raise your hand if you want to pay higher dues, right? So what's a way that we could resource that mission, but do it in a way that advances these shared interests? And ultimately, we looked at the pallet design system as a leading edge of a way to do that. And we doubled our international membership. We went to international trade shows and did a lot of the steps that associations take. We hired very competent staff that helps us work that way. But most importantly, we listen to our members. They pulled us into those markets, right? And so when you look at a Mexico chapter as an example, there were 12 people in a room, I don't know, 4 years ago. We had 350 people at our meeting this year, right? And yes, we have phenomenal staff that's leading our efforts down there, but the members themselves are calling people and saying, this is a can't miss meeting. And so you just build, we're all watching sports right now, and the teams that win all of a sudden have all these fans, right? It's those bandwagons. When you create an organization that's winning, people want to be a part of that.
Yeah, for sure. I do think the non-dues revenue is so essential for associations. And you hear there's a million sessions a day, seminars all the time. But what made you guys think software business? And is that something, I think that's something that might scare other associations, but what would your advice be to go for it there?
Yeah, we're all a business, right? And yeah, we may be a nonprofit, which means we're not turning any excess revenue back over to shareholders. But ultimately, if you can solve your members' problems, and in our case, if you just go back, and this is way before me, I can't take credit for this at all. The industry was spending an awful lot of money designing a pallet, sending it off to be broken so they knew what its design values were. If you think about the back deck in your house, it can be in any size or shape you want it to, and you have confidence that you can have a party on it. Why? Because of design span tables, right? And that's all essentially what a wooden pallet is. So this industry said, why don't we develop a highly customizable program? And they did this before Microsoft Windows even came out. These truly are visionary entrepreneurs in this industry. And so they built a pallet design lab at Virginia Tech. They funded it and did a bunch of research. And then over time on our staff, we have a structural engineer, we have software engineers, we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in research and development. But yeah, it's not something you just do as a side project. It's a pretty big deal. But ultimately, that's what made it become this global standard of pallet design, was that commitment for decades for that R&D.
That's so cool. My favorite things about this podcast is hearing the different ways that associations really deliver on the value prop for their members. And this by far has to be one of the most interesting and unique ways. And it's just very cool. And talk about filling a need. It really is awesome that you guys have done this and provided such a great value to members.
If I can interrupt or just build off of what you just said, what it has allowed us to do is advance a lot of policy goals as well. And so because we've worked on these issues related to the pallet, who does the pallet connect to? It connects to pallet users, which is 90% of the US market is using wooden pallets, right? And so their issues become our issues, but their strength becomes our strength. And so when you're talking about issues like sustainability, circularity, you're talking any global policy related items that affect international shipments and supply chains, Jason's getting phone calls that we would have never gotten if we didn't have this software system.
Yeah, that's context. And I'd love to dig into some of those real examples of your global advocacy. So I know you had a significant win in Brussels recently, influencing package regulations in the EU that was really to the benefit of all international importers and exporters. Jason, can you share some key takeaways there?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's the biggest one for me was just the fact that, we always say, right? But this kind of really illustrated it. And it's that you have to be at the table telling your own story, right? It's not in the absence of your viewpoint, your experience, your industry's perspective and needs. Policymakers are going to craft regulations and legislations, and it's just not going to take into account the realities of your business. And what we found in Brussels was just this, right? They had drafted something that was going to have an impact, not just on our industry, but really on all of our customer segments, right? And as we said, 90% of everything moves on a wood pallet or wood packaging at some point. And so it was a dramatic impact that would really have disrupted the supply chain. But because policymakers didn't necessarily, in the initial drafting phase, didn't necessarily hear from the totality of the industry and just heard certain pieces here and there, they crafted something that did not take into account the realities. The other aspect is that going back to what we were saying a little bit earlier is that these issues, we obviously very important to the supply chain, but I'm not going to maybe necessarily overstate things. It's a little bit easy for pallets to go under the radar, I guess is what I would say. We're literally and figuratively, maybe in some regards. But what we found was that we had not necessarily heard about this until a little bit later in the process. And it really highlighted the fact that if we may not have heard about it at all, because we weren't based in Brussels, we're not necessarily with a large footprint there until now. But because of our allies, because of our partners, they raised this issue for us and they said, hey, this might have an impact on you. And it really was able to, our network and our relationships were really able to highlight the fact that we needed to get involved. And thankfully, we had the resources. We had a board that was engaged and that was willing to allocate the funds necessary for us to go in and truly be effective. When something like this comes up and when we are wanting to have an impact, particularly on legislation that's already in the process, and go in half-heartedly. We really have to go in, have to hire the best, have to be able to go in and have a culturally sensitive team that's actually connected on the ground there, not try to parachute in and do your own thing. And so that's why we ended up hiring really the top firm in Brussels to speak on our behalf, to represent the industry, and to be able to help us build a coalition that would push back on this. So those are some of the kind of top takeaways I point to. It's just that you really need to not only be able to tell your own story, but be able to tell it well and in a way that's relevant to the audience that you're speaking to. And that's what we were able to do in Brussels and able to have this success.
As a cause person, you're hitting on my passion point here of being able to tell your own story, because if you don't, someone else, it's all about controlling the narrative and getting the story out there that needs to be told, because no one else can do it like you can. That's some great insight in terms of telling the story, having the right partners, being smart and culturally sensitive too. That all is such great stuff there. I want to get into the success with the European packaging and waste regulation and how you navigated the negotiations, because I think that's a whole nother piece of that. But you did that in a way that really had an impact on both your EU and your non-EU members. So I'd love to hear what those negotiations look like and how you go to the table for something like that.
So part of being able to work with a good partner in Brussels was that pretty early on, we identified that we needed to be able to come in and not just sound like we were American industry coming in last minute and just asking for special favors, right? And just going in and telling them, you're doing it all wrong, which I may have wanted to do, but we didn't do that. So thankfully, we did not do that. No. So we went in and we told a story from a very global perspective. As you identify, this would have had an impact to not just pallet manufacturers and their customers outside of the EU, but also inside of the EU. And because we already had an existing network of allies, we were able to get letters, and not just letters, but actually follow them up with a lot of meetings and personal relationship from our team of consultants. These letters were signed and our position was supported by our Canadian allies, by our UK, Irish allies, the broader EU, trade associations, our Mexican members, and members that we have in other segments of the world as well. And so we were able to paint a picture of the impact of this regulation in a way that was very clear to policymakers, that the disruption would be to their global supply chains, not just to the products that were crossing back and forth between the EU, or just from the US to the EU, much less back and forth between both regions. And so that was, I would think, probably one of the key pillars of why we were able to be successful. But then the other piece was the fact that we did have a lot of research and data, which we haven't touched on too much yet, but we have some of the leading research in the industry globally, really the only research that's for the benefit of the whole industry on a sustainability front, and being able to talk about the carbon footprint of pallets and to be able to talk about the safety of pallets from the PDS perspective. Being able to use our experience and our research with the pallet design system and in combination with our environmental data meant that policymakers were a lot more willing to listen to us. We're able to, as we talk through scenarios and try to make it real for them, we're able to really realize how the unintended consequences of the language would have a disruptive impact. And finally, I think the other piece is that we very strongly believe in having an approach of trying to be collaborators with the policymakers. We may not necessarily agree in the way that they're going about it, but we can more often than not sit at the table with them and say, look, we believe in your end goal. Let us help you reach that in a way that's not going to harm your own small and medium-sized businesses in your region, but the supply chain globally, and ensure that critical products are able to continue to enter the EU without disruption. And that's the posture that we took. And for your listeners who may not be aware of this, the packaging and packaging waste regulation is the heaviest lobbied piece of legislation that's ever been passed in the EU. So in their history, no piece of regulation has had this many groups lobbying it, because it impacted basically every single segment. And because of that, they were very tired of talking to lobbyists like myself, especially because a lot of folks were going in there to yell at them. And so they really appreciated our approach. They really appreciated the fact that we understood that, particularly at this stage when we were getting engaged, they wanted constructive and collaborative feedback. And that's what we were able to provide. And because of that, we were able to have really remarkable success, and really credit to the team that we were working with, that we continue to work with there in Brussels, who leveraged their relationships and put us at the table with office, and we were able to find what we feel is a bit of an elegant solution to the problem that still advanced the overall goals of the PPWR regulation that they were working on.
Yeah, amazing. That's an awesome insider look in terms of how that works. I think global advocacy can sound daunting for an association that's never done it before, but that's really helpful to just hear the process. And this is what we did, and this is how it worked. So that's awesome. You mentioned sustainability in there, though. So I want to ask the $1,000,000 question. So with over $400 billion in trade annually that's reliant on wooden pallets, how do you balance sustainability regulations while ensuring fair trade policies? That's a pretty fine line to walk.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that data, right? We're able to point to the fact that we've done research in partnership, right? The research in partnership, not just our own research, but it's in partnership with USDA Forest Products Lab and third-party verified by UL. So when we're talking about the data that we found, our economic footprint, the fact that we're potentially carbon negative or neutral in some regards for when it comes to the pallet and our environmental footprint, we're doing so not just going in there and saying, we promise, we're very good, wood is good. We're able to actually point to this data and talk about it. And when you look at it, when we're telling our story and how we have this environmental footprint and the impact that we have on the broader supply chain. For example, if you're looking at how much packaging you're going to be utilizing to ensure that products are getting to where they need to be safely, it's a very easy story for us to tell that wood is the best product to do those, to do fully renewable, fully recyclable, and actually recycled. And we have all the data to back that up. And then the other aspect of it, going back to PDS, we're mentioning it a lot, but it really is critical to a lot of what we do, is that we're able to point to the software that also, if you want to make sure that we're using our resources wisely, the PDS software and all of the research that we've done in making it the leading software in the world for this type of work, is that it's enabling you to build the packaging specifically fit for its purpose in a way that doesn't overutilize that valuable resource. It allows you to really take that resource and spread it out into even more packaging while still accomplishing the goal of ensuring that the product gets there safely. So when we go into policymakers and talk to them about this and then point to what the alternative might be, right? And the alternative of the environmental footprint of utilizing potentially other materials in that regard, or shipping products that then may not get there safely. And now you've had environmental footprint, right? All that waste that gets generated because the product didn't get there in one piece, then it's pretty much a no-brainer to be able to acknowledge the fact that we are valuable, we have this environmental footprint that's positive, and be able to then get to work on trying to find what policy solutions would accomplish their goals while not unnecessarily harming the industry.
Love it. And to fuel global advocacy, global presence has to be there. And so we talked about this amazing growth you've had there, but I'd love to dig into how you made that happen. launching a new association in a different market, it's no small feat. You created the Mexico chapter from scratch and you talked about the people there and the growth of that. What insights can you share about that process?
Yeah, and I think it might be helpful to take even a step back from that, right? If you go back to that original strategic plan and talked about global thought leadership, you really have to look at that SWOT analysis of yourself as an organization with what that future vision looks like that's really been outlined by your membership to your board. And in our case, we had a very strong membership in the United States. We had an existing amount of strength in a few other countries. We obviously have the pallet design system, right? So you look at some of those tools that you have. We realized when we started to look at growth, we can't do it all on our own. And we also, there are areas where we're going to have relative strengths and areas where we're going to have relative weaknesses. So when we started looking at it, we said, who can we help? What are the organizations out there, back to what Jason was talking about, that we can identify that have certain goals that we can play a role that helps them achieve those? So we started off by creating these strategic partnership agreements with other trade associations globally where, quite simply, if you join that association, you can have access to our software system at a significant discount. So what did that do? It drove membership growth in other associations. That's something they appreciated, right? And ultimately, we connected the industry closer together, which starts to connect your policy goals. It starts to have you speak as one industry with one voice globally. And then as you start going around, you realize in some areas, there's not necessarily an association there that you can partner with that will achieve that. And when we were looking at Mexico, and obviously there's a lot of policy related interest in the United States and Canada and Mexico, right? That's why we have a USMCA. We realized that that's an area where we needed a strong organization. There wasn't one there. So we started this really listen and learn tour. We've had members in Mexico for 30 years. So it's not an area we're completely unfamiliar with, but we really didn't, beyond that core group of members, have a clear sense of what their needs, wants, expectations were. So for Mexico specifically, we had a 3-month project. We went through and listened to them. I mentioned that to you as well when we developed our strategic plan, right? We did focus groups and town hall meetings. We did a lot of the same in Mexico. And once you listen to it, you realize their needs aren't the same as folks from Mississippi or New Hampshire, right? So once you understand what those needs are, you start to build a whole program. In essence, you're creating an association from scratch, right? And ultimately, once you do that and you know what they want to achieve, then you've got to hire incredibly competent staff, right, that can provide that level of service. And then you got to deliver. You've got to show them that commitment. You've got to provide the resources. You've got to show them that you're listening to them. And that has led to 300% growth or whatever down in Mexico. But beyond that, our last meeting, I mentioned we had 350 or so people at. What was most interesting to me is we had representatives from the leading pallet companies from 2/3 of the states of Mexico attend that meeting, right? Think about that. You put on a meeting in the US and you get 2/3 of the states of the US represented at that meeting. You're probably doing something right. It's not just a regional. Secondly, we had 13 different countries showing up, 9 different Spanish speaking countries were represented. And so it's become this hub, this Latin America hub through the wood pallet sector. It has led us to now we have a strategic partnership agreement in Brazil, and we're closer with all sorts of organizations from Mexico South. And so once you start listening to and delivering to those needs, wants, expectations of that user group, they will step up. We say it with a little wink, but they will hand you their wallets, right? You have built their trust to advance their business interests. Once you do that and they're all in, they are all in. And that's what we're very fortunate to have today.
That's awesome. And another big piece of the growth I want to get to is the foundation. A lot of associations have a foundation as part of their efforts. Really, for you all, played a crucial role in funding research on safety, sustainability, innovation. And one stat you sent over that I thought was great is you've gone from funding $20,000 a year in projects to $1 million annually now. How did you drive this growth?
Yeah, it's the same that same formula. What's so interesting to me, when you're really listening to your members and you can deliver the products they need, they know what's the value of an association. You can do things for a group cheaper than they can do it by themselves, more efficiently than they could do it, and with greater international approval, right? So everything we do is ISO or third-party vetted. I mean, I'll tell you the story that we were able to create and sell initially. So that's the first thing, right? You've got to build an inspirational vision, right? When you can build a shared vision and mission that inspires your team, your staff, as well as your volunteers, people will absolutely give you blood, sweat, and tears, right, to achieve that because you've got that unity. And so from the foundation standpoint, we were able to paint a picture that said, and this is going to be very similar to many people listening here. The industry felt underrepresented, underappreciated, right? That how do we change that? How do we get a voice for our industry? And they're a family business industry. Their names are in the side of businesses, right? That you go up to the building, who owns it? And so they had tremendous pride in their industry. And they wanted that really represented by, are understood by people and respected by people, whether it's their customers or it was members of Congress and other policy folks. And so we sat here and said, look, you look at the fundamental resource, we know we're growing more trees than we're harvesting, right? So that's a pretty good place. It's a sustainable, renewable resource. The industry itself, when you look at the manufacturing of pallets, we didn't know the environmental footprint. And so we sold to them a 5-year project to develop an environmental product declaration. Those are not inexpensive. It's a lot of work, but they bought in because they believed their product had the best carbon footprint out there. And what we found through using this ISO process, that they were correct, right? You make the planet better with every wood pallet used, right? That EPD was a tremendous development. Secondly, people were worried about what's the life cycle of a wood pallet? What happens to it? Is it going straight to a landfill? And our industry was very confident it wasn't. We had to fund a bunch of research and independent research that looked at the landfill footprint issue and came out and found out that we're the most recovered recycled packaging product on the planet, right? We have a 97% recycling rate. So you start connecting these dots and you start fulfilling that vision that you set out at the very beginning, but you only do it when they step up and they write those checks. And so when we built in that shared vision, that shared mission, that unity of purpose, it just built on itself. We went from 20,000 when I came here, it was 20,000 a year, right? As you pointed out, and next year was 45, and then it was 90, and then it went up to 150. Nothing happens overnight. You look at the book Atomic Habits or any of the others out there that talk about 1% improvements. You just keep building on it. And now we hit our first year of 1 million ever. And so you can get there. You just have to start somewhere.
I love Atomic Habits, but I also love you telling that truth behind it, because people see those numbers often or flashy stats and it seems impossible, because how do I go from this small number to this huge number? But that's a great way to break it down. And I appreciate you giving us that insight. What's next? So what are your next big goals for global advocacy, expanding sustainability efforts? What's on the plate? You've accomplished so much, but I'm sure you still have some big goals ahead.
It's interesting you would ask that or say that because we did just have another, we have a strategic planning review every year, but they really sat down this year and intentionally said, okay, wow, we just had several record years. We really achieved that big, hairy, audacious goal we set out 10 plus years ago. What does the future look like? And it's even more global, to put it simply. It's also even more member engagement. I think that's the part of an association. When I came on and I joke with the search committee at the time still, they were talking about how they wanted to see change. And my response during the interview was, do you want to change the beer at the bar or do you want to really fundamentally change? And that's a hard issue to really get to the bottom of, right? For organizations, because it can be painful. Change is painful. Think about it in our own lives, right? We want to change our physical fitness or lose weight. It's not just eating right. You've also got to work out and you got to keep doing it. And you've got to resource that mission. And it is not easy. Same thing for organizations. And so this organization recognizes now that we're being brought into these international markets much more frequently. Back to Jason's point, you can't parachute into Brussels and leave. You can't say you care about Mexico and Latin America and you send them newsletters in English. right? You can't, for instance, and this is one thing we're battling, we're an international organization, but do we have our meetings only in the US? Or do we start having more board meetings and other meetings globally? So truly, when you look at being global and having a global voice, I mean, as I said, we're being called into that. We're the largest wood packaging trade association globally. They're wanting to see us more in South Africa or Australia. How do you resource that mission? How do you put boots on the ground in those markets? So those are a lot of the conversations that we're going to be having over the coming weeks, months, years, is how do we help them achieve that vision?
And I can just add, I think another piece to that is as you continue to have success, right, it enables you to develop new partners. In this case, we've gotten outside funding to help us so that we can then redeploy some of the funding that we've had, for example, with our environmental product declaration, life cycle assessment. Now, some of that funding will come from the U.S. government to help us with, we can redeploy some of our member contributions to the foundation to other priorities. With the PDS, we're working on making that even more critical to companies' businesses. Going back to sustainability, now the PDS will have a carbon calculator built into it that is fully customizable and that has the ability to help them develop net zero targets for their companies, which increasingly their clients are requiring of them. Right. So these are all things that we're doing to try to advance and keep up with our members and where the industry is going. As this, we're all gas, no break right now, just trying to keep up, trying to stay ahead and trying to deliver on the needs that our members maybe have barely started talking to us about, both that from talking to folks from a global perspective we know are coming in some regards, right? Something happened first in Europe or in California or in other places and then they spread. And so having our ear to the ground is helping us to predict where some of these things are going and ensure that we're well positioned to keep up and to provide the resources that our members need.
And I'll go back and add to what Jason just added, because not to bury the lead here, but I had a mentor early on in my career say that if you're not changing at or faster than the pace of change of your industry, you're on the path of irrelevancy, right? And so I would challenge anybody listening, but certainly I constantly challenge myself. Is our industry changing? Is our world around us changing? What pace is it changing? And what pace is our association changing, or our foundation, or our overall organization's strategic plan? If we can't match or be faster than that, then really what's the point? Right? And so that's the challenge that I put out for our staff, but I live every day is we've got that. Jason said, and I hadn't heard that before, that whole all gas, no break, but it really is. You've just got to be running. You've got to run to stay relevant.
I love it. I love all of this. I love that even after all these big accomplishments, you have such big goals, and I'm so appreciative of all the amazing insights you guys have shared with our listeners today. This will be such a great episode for everyone and a lot of good takeaways. Before we let you go, though, we love to wrap up every episode with a just for fun portion so our listeners can get to know a little bit more about who you are. So first one's easy. Brett, we'll let you kick this one off. Where did you grow up?
Actually, I grew up all over, but probably my most formative was South Dakota.
Great. And Jason?
I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, like right all around it, most of my life.
Love it. All right, Jason, what is your Starbucks order or go-to morning drink if you're not a Starbucks fan?
My Starbucks order is, well, right now, is a vanilla latte with oat milk.
Like it. Brent?
I'd have to say there's one area of my life I don't change with any speed. It's a cup of coffee with a little bit of milk on the front porch.
I love it. All right. We'll let Brent take this next one first and then put Jason on the spot in front of his boss. So if you won the lottery tomorrow, would you still work?
Oh, absolutely. I won the lottery by getting this job.
All right, Jason, what's your answer?
The very literally answer is it depends. If it's a certain amount and below, absolutely, I'll be here. If it's above a certain amount, you won't hear from me. You'll just, there'll be signs that I won the lotto, but I won't have, well,
Amazing. Oh, great. What's the last show you binged watched?
For me, it's Industry on HBO. I just finished binging the last 2 seasons of that.
Nice.
Gosh, it has been a while for me since I've binge watched something. I'm not on TV or those streaming services very often.
That's all right. I mean, I have a 3-year-old, so for me, it's Bluey, so I can't really judge anyone. All right. Brent, what's a food you can't live without?
Oh my gosh, it'd have to be bagels with peanut butter.
All right. Jason.
I grew up eating a lot of rice and beans, and yeah, I could not live without those.
Nice. And Jason, what's your bucket list travel destination?
That's very good. I just checked a couple off my list recently. Probably right now, it would be the Serengeti.
Ooh, nice. I like that one. Brent, how about you?
Any place with family and no technology.
Nice. I love it. Awesome. Guys, thank you again. This has been so fun, so insightful, and just so appreciate your time with the A100 today. That's a wrap for today's episode. The Association 100 podcast is a production of Onward and Upward Marketing and Communications, where our mission is to make associations and nonprofits the go-to source in their industries through earned media and thought leadership. This podcast is an extension of the A100 newsletter, a bi-monthly collection of best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies delivered straight to your inbox. Have you undertaken a big change at your association, or do you have some words of wisdom from the trenches of association life? We want to hear from you, and so do our listeners. Drop us a note at info@onwardupward.com. That's info@onwrdupwrd.com. If you like what you heard today, be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share with your friends and colleagues. We're available anywhere podcasts are found. Come back next week for more association inspiration and insights. Thanks for tuning in.